You don't like to talk then?
Well, not really. Sometimes, if there's something to say, but there's really nothing to say these days.
To the world, he was the quiet Beatle, George Harrison, the spiritual, meditative soul of the most famous band in history, a man who sang of peace, love, and the rising sun. But behind that serene public image was a man of deeply held convictions, a musician with an almost painfully high standard for artistic integrity. And when he felt those standards were being violated, or when he ran into what he saw as inauthenticity, his opinions could be brutally honest and surprisingly sharp. Now, hate is a strong word, especially for a man who dedicated much of his life to spiritual enlightenment. But the musicians on this list weren't just the subject of a passing negative comment. They found themselves on the receiving end of George Harrison's most pointed and public criticism. Today, we're counting down the 6 musicians who, in George's eyes, just didn't make the cut. The names on this list and the stories behind his feelings might just change the way you see the quiet Beatle forever. Coming in at number 6 is a group that defined an entire era of music, the legendary Bee Gees. Harrison's issue wasn't so much with the brothers Gibb themselves, but with a specific, high-profile project they took on in 1978. The musical film SGT, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, produced by the Bee Gees manager Robert Stigwood. The film was meant to be a rock opera woven around iconic Lennon-McCartney songs, starring Peter Frampton and the Bee Gees at the height of their Saturday Night Fever fame. On paper, it was a clash of titans. In reality, it was a critical and commercial disaster. For George Harrison, this wasn't just a bad movie. It was an affront. The Beatles' SGT Pepper album was a cultural landmark, a masterpiece that had redefined what a rock album could be. To see its legacy used for what he saw as a hollow, commercial venture was deeply frustrating. While Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr attended the film's premiere, George stayed away. His public comments were measured, but his disdain was clear. When asked about it in 1979, Harrison said, "The reports on it were so bad that I didn't want to see it." He expressed a kind of pity for the artists involved, suggesting they'd been led into a fundamentally misguided project. He reportedly felt the film did a disservice to the Beatles' legacy and damaged the Bee Gees and Peter Frampton's careers by putting them in a silly and impossible situation. In one interview, Harrison joked, "Maybe we should go and do the Robert Stigwood story or something," before admitting the film was all right, because they've paid the copyright on the songs and made up their own storyline. Harrison's criticism wasn't about a dislike for disco, it was about artistic authenticity. The SGT Pepper album was a work of genuine inspiration. The film, in his eyes, was the opposite, a manufactured product that used the cultural weight of the Beatles' music for commercial gain without understanding its soul. The Bee Gees, as the faces of the project, became the focal point for this disappointment. For George, it wasn't personal animosity. It was about the principle of the matter. At number 5, we have a feud that was less about artistic philosophy and more about a very public, very pointed disagreement over a single song. The band was the Hollies, and the song was George Harrison's own "If I Needed Someone." In late 1965, the Hollies got an early copy of "If I Needed Someone" from the upcoming Rubber Soul album and rushed to record it. They released their version as a single on December 3, 1965. It's the very same day Rubber Soul hit the shelves. This simultaneous release was likely the first point of irritation for Harrison. But his displeasure went way beyond a simple scheduling clash. He was deeply unhappy with their version of his song. Harrison did not mince words. In an interview with the New Musical Express, he delivered a stunningly blunt verdict. "I think the Hollies' version of my song, 'If I Needed Someone,' is rubbish." He declared, "They've spoiled it." He then took a shot at their entire artistic approach, saying the Hollies are all right musically, But the way they do their records, they sound like session men who've just got together in a studio without ever seeing each other before. Technically good, yes? But that's all. This was a major public slap from a member of the world's biggest band, and it stung. Harley's vocalist Graham Nash fired back, retorting, "Not only do these comments disappoint and hurt us, but we are sick and tired of everything the Beatles say or do being taken as law." He then cleverly asked if Harisson, having found their version so disgusting, would donate all the royalties from their record to charity. For Harisson, the song was deeply personal. It was heavily influenced by the jangling 12-string guitar sound of the Byrds, a band he greatly admired. He had even sent an advance copy to the Byrds, Roger McGuinn, acknowledging the riff was a direct tribute to their song The Bells of Rhymney. He felt the Hollies' polished pop version completely missed the point. It was, in his view, a technically proficient but soulless reading of his work. This spat showed a core part of Harrison's personality. He held his music to an incredibly high standard and wasn't afraid to call out those he felt fell short. Our fourth entry is a band often cast as the Beatles' ultimate rivals, the Rolling Stones. The whole Beatles versus Stones narrative was mostly a media creation. In reality, the relationship was a mix of friendship, mutual respect, and, on George's part, a healthy dose of critical skepticism. In the early days, the bands were close. It was George Harrison himself who recommended the Stones to Decca's Dick Rotha, very man who had famously turned down the Beatles. But as both bands exploded, Harrison started to see the Stones as followers, not leaders, walking a path the Beatles had just paved. He grumbled about how Rubber Soul was followed by Aftermath and SGT, Pepper by their Satanic Majesty's Request. His frustration wasn't about competition. It was about what he perceived as a lack of originality. He wanted them to write your own map. Mick Jagger, in particular, seemed to be a source of some of Harrison's slight irritation. Mick was always lurking around in the background, trying to find out what was happening, Harrison once recalled, noting how Jagger tagged along when the Beatles went to a seminar with the Maharishi, while Jagger later spoke respectfully of Harrison's spirituality at the time. George seemed to view him as something of a spiritual tourist. This perception of the Stones as imitators was the core of his critique. He respected their blues roots, but seemed to believe they relied too much on an image rather than pushing their own creative boundaries. While John and Paul might have engaged in more public jousting with the Stones, George's criticism was quieter, but perhaps more fundamental. It wasn't hatred. It was the disappointment of a fellow artist who wished they would step out from behind the Beatles' shadow. This complex dynamic of friendship and critique makes the Stones a fascinating entry on this list. At number 3, we find the band that defined the California sound, the Beach Boys. This is one of the most intriguing cases because it put George in direct opposition to his own bandmate, Paul McCartney, while Paul famously revered Brian Wilson as a genius, calling God Only Knows the greatest song ever written. George's assessment was decidedly less enthusiastic. George was increasingly drawn to the spiritual and introspective, and in his view, the Beach Boys represented a kind of glossy pop that lacked the depth he craved. While the world heard beautiful, intricate harmonies, George heard something that struck him as artificial. This feeling reportedly solidified after the Beatles met the group in 1965. With Harrison being taken aback by what he saw as a lack of instrumental prowess, the supposed rivalry intensified around 1966-67. With the release of Pet Sounds and SGT, Peppers, these albums are forever linked in a historic musical dialogue. Paul was a vocal champion of Pet Sounds, but George remained unimpressed, reportedly feeling its concept overshadowed its substance, while direct quotes of Harrison disparaging the Beach Boys are scarce. Counts from the Beatles' inner circle paint a consistent picture of his reservations. Yet there's a fascinating twist. A 45 RPM single of the Beach Boys, The Little Girl I Once Knew, was found. in George's personal jukebox. He even traveled to Paris with John Lennon in December 1967, specifically to see a Beach Boys concert. So, what does this mean? It seems George's issue wasn't with every song the Beach Boys recorded, but with their overall ethos. He was searching for profound truth and saw their music, no matter how well crafted, as a reflection of a shallower world. He was looking for soul and found what he considered to be slick commercial craft. The fact that his bandmate Paul was their biggest fan in Britain likely only sharpened the contrast in his mind. In the number 2 spot is a band created to be a direct response to Beatlemania. They were the prefab for a group assembled for a TV show to capture the same pop energy as A Hard Day's Night. They were, of course, the Monkees, for a musician as dedicated to authenticity as George Harrison. The Monkees represented a cardinal sin. They were manufactured. The Beatles had paid their dues in the clubs of Hamburg and Liverpool. The Monkees were cast in auditions. In the beginning, they didn't even play the instruments on their own records. This was the opposite of everything George believed in. He saw music as pure self-expression. The Monkees, in his view, were a TV product first and a band second. But the story is more nuanced than simple disdain. The members of the two bands did interact, and on friendly terms. The Beatles threw a party for the Monkees in London. Mike Nesmith attended the A Day in the Life recording session. And Peter Tork even had a jam session with George. So where does the idea of George's dislike come from? It's about that philosophical opposition to their origin story. Publicly, he was polite. One quote attributed to him says, "The Monkees are still finding out who they are. And they seem to be improving as performers each time I see them." But it's impossible to ignore the context. The Monkees fought for and won creative control. But in the beginning, they represented the showbiz side of the music business that George loathed. He famously said he wanted to be successful, not famous. The Monkees were the living embodiment of fame preceding substance. While he may have been personally friendly with the members, his philosophical opposition to what they represented was likely profound. It was a battle of ideals, the grit of a band forged in basement clubs versus the polish of a band created in a TV studio. And now we arrive at number 1. The musician who received the most sustained, personal, and creatively charged criticism from George Harrison was not a rival or an imitator. He was a man George called a brother, a musical partner with whom he had changed the world. He was Paul Mick, Cartney. To call this hatred is to miss the point of one of the most complex relationships in music history. It was a deep frustration born from years of feeling creatively stifled. For much of the Beatles' career, Harrison struggled to get his own songs onto their albums, fighting for a spot against the Lennon-McCartney powerhouse. As the Beatles' music evolved, this frustration focused on Paul. In George's eyes, Paul became increasingly domineering in the studio. This dynamic is painfully visible in the Let It Be film, where a weary Harrison tells Paul, "I'll play whatever you want me to play. Or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." It was the sound of a musician at his breaking point. Even Paul's bass playing, widely seen as brilliant, became a point of contention. George often found it too busy for his songs. During the recording of something, he famously had to tell Paul to simplify his bass line. This friction lasted for years. In a scathing 1974 interview, when asked about a Beatles reunion, George said he'd rather have Willie Weeks on bass than Paul McCartney. He immediately clarified, "It's nothing personal. It's just from a musical point of view. I prefer a session." Musician over Paul was the ultimate musical rebuke. He acknowledged Paul was a fine bass player, but added the crucial qualifier, "But he's a bit overpowering at times." This wasn't a simple feud. It was a creative partnership breaking under its own weight. George respected Paul's immense talent, but that talent came with a controlling instinct George could no longer tolerate. He felt his own musical identity was being suffocated. "The biggest break in my career," he once said, "was getting into the Beatles in 1962. The second biggest break was getting out of them." That statement perfectly encapsulates his relationship with the band and, by extension, its most hands-on musical director. Paul McCartney. George Harrison was a man of contrasts. The spiritual seeker with a sharp tongue, the quiet Beatle with loud opinions. His criticisms weren't born from malice, but from a profound respect for musical authenticity. Which of George's opinions surprised you the most? Do you think his criticisms were justified, or was he being too harsh? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. We'd love to hear your perspective, from a commercialized movie to a manufactured TV band. And culminating in the intense friction within his own group, George Harrison's criticisms reveal a man who cared deeply about music. He wasn't just a guitarist. He was a guardian of what he believed made music meaningful. His sharpest words were for those he felt were treating the art form as a commodity or a vehicle for ego, rather than as a path to a deeper truth. The quiet Beatle had one of the clearest and most uncompromising voices in rock and roll. He just chose to speak it through his music and a set of brutally honest opinions that give us a richer, more complex understanding of the man behind the legend. If you enjoyed this deep dive into music history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's next. Thanks for watching.